Have you ever sat in a room so quiet you could hear your own heart breaking? That's where I was, in a sterile lawyer's office that smelled of lemon polish and old paper, when my daughter-in-law, Rebecca, stood up. She smoothed down a non-existent wrinkle on her perfect black suit, and with the same polite tone she'd used to order coffee, she announced she was cutting me out of my husband Patrick's entire $52 million estate. Just like that. I didn't cry. I think my body forgot how. I just sat there, frozen, my mind replaying the last 6 months, sponging his forehead, helping him walk from the bed to the chair, reading to him until my voice grew hoarse while she was off at conferences in cities I couldn't even name. She spoke of him in the past tense long before he was gone, and now she acted as if I had never existed at all. But then the strangest thing happened. The lawyer, a man who had known Patrick for 30 years, let out a soft, almost imperceptible chuckle. It was a tiny sound, but it cut through the thick, cold silence in that room, and something inside me shifted. It was the first clue that my Patrick, my wonderful, clever husband, had hidden something before he died. And in that moment, it felt like he was about to speak to me from beyond the grave. The last of the funeral guests had finally driven away, their headlights cutting through the twilight of the garden. They left behind a scattering of folding chairs and half-full cups of coffee that had long gone cold, and the cloying, sweet scent of lilies that hung in the air like a shroud. No one, not even Rebecca, thought to ask if I needed a ride home from my own husband's farewell. She had arranged it all, of course. Every flower, every photograph in the slideshow, every perfectly timed moment of somber reflection was her creation. It was flawless in a way that felt like an intrusion, cold and rehearsed, like the final act of a play I hadn't been invited to. Patrick would have hated it. He always said funerals should be messy, filled with loud crying and bad jokes. He believed they should feel real. This felt like a performance. When I finally stepped back into the house we'd shared for 43 years, the silence was deafening. Rebecca was at the dining room table, her back to me, stacking papers into neat folders. She moved like a machine, all efficiency and no heart. I cleared my throat, a small sound, but she didn't look up. "We'll be moving ahead with the legal processing next week," she said, her voice clipped and distant. "I've arranged everything with the firm. No mention of me. No question about what I might want. Not a single acknowledgement of the fact that I had slept in a chair beside his hospital bed for months. I wanted to believe it was grief that made her so cold, but then she turned and handed me a small velvet box. "He asked me to give you this," she said, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. Inside was a tie clip, a simple silver clip, not even one of his favorites. There was no note, no letter, nothing. Patrick, who filled journals with his thoughts and left me love notes on the kitchen counter, had been reduced to this. A cold piece of metal. That night, sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea I didn't remember making, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the late autumn air. The house still smelled of his aftershave, his books were still piled in the hallway, but for the first time, I felt like a stranger in the home we had built together. It was as if my name had been quietly erased from every room, and I was just beginning to realize I was the only one who hadn't been given the new script. Have you ever looked around your own home and felt utterly lost? That's the feeling that settled deep in my bones that night, and it was only the beginning. The invitation to the estate meeting arrived via email, sent by Rebecca's assistant. The subject line was cold, clinical. Estate administration meeting scheduled. No, I hope you're holding up, no kindness. Just a time and a place, like a dental appointment. I was 5 minutes late that morning. The traffic was a crawl, but the truth is, I'd pulled over twice, my hands trembling on the steering wheel, wondering if I should even go. The office was on the 30th floor, a sleek modern place that smelled of eucalyptus and money. A young woman gave me a look that said I clearly didn't belong, and led me to a conference room where 7 people in dark suits sat around a long, polished table. Rebecca was at the head, her eyes fixed on a stack of folders. She didn't stand. She didn't say my name. She just gave a slight nod toward the only empty chair at the far end of the table, away from everything and everyone. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, the only person without a pen. "As executor of the estate," Rebecca began, her voice sharp, "I'll be walking us through the distribution of assets." She went through it all: stocks, trust accounts, properties, a winery Patrick had invested in. Then she dropped the bomb. 6 months ago, Patrick had transferred primary control of the family trust to her. I felt the air leave my lungs. It wasn't possible. I had managed that trust with him for 20 years. He would have told me. He would have discussed it with me over dinner. But Rebecca kept reading, her voice a monotone drone, listing off allocations like inventory. My name was never mentioned. Finally, one of the lawyers asked, "And Mrs. Sloane's share?" Rebecca barely glanced up from her papers. "There are no remaining distributions assigned to her under the current filing." The words hung in the air. Just like that, I was erased. I wasn't a widow. I wasn't even a line item. I was nothing. When it was over, I walked out without a word, the cold city air hitting my cheeks like a slap. Rebecca hadn't just claimed my husband's money. She had claimed our history, our life, our story. And she had done it so quietly, no one had even thought to question it. That afternoon, I didn't turn on the lights. I just sat in Patrick's study as the sun went down, the silence of the house pressing in on me. His cane was still propped by the back door, right where he'd left it after his last chemo appointment. I couldn't bring myself to move it. Later, almost without thinking, my hands went to his desk drawer. It squeaked, the same familiar sound it had always made. He used to say it needed oiling, but I loved that sound. It meant he was home. Inside, beneath old receipts and his favorite pencil, I found it. A small, unlabeled manila folder. My heart started to beat a little faster as I opened it. There were 3 sheets of paper inside. The first was a handwritten note from Patrick. His script was shaky, but it was unmistakably his. "Rebecca wants me to update the will," he'd written. "Says it's for clarity. I think she's being too careful. She started drawing up papers on my behalf. I haven't signed anything yet. I haven't told Marietta. I know she'd ask the questions I'm afraid of." I read it again and again. He'd had doubts. He had sensed something was wrong, but he hadn't told me, maybe to protect me. The second page was a photocopy of a will I had never seen, with handwritten notes in the margins. My name was there, in a sentence that read, "I leave my personal assets to my wife Marietta Sloane." It had been crossed out with a thick, angry line. Beside it, a note. "Discuss with Rebecca." The third page was a schedule of legal appointments from months ago, on days when Rebecca had come to the hospital to give me a break. He hadn't been resting. He'd been meeting with lawyers she had arranged. The folder was thin, but it felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. I remembered a dinner, not long before he got really sick. He'd reached across the table and squeezed my wrist. "You don't have to worry about anything, Mari," he'd said. "I've made sure of that." Now, all I could feel was the cold imprint of his absence and the chilling realization that this wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. It's a strange thing, isn't it? How a person's presence can linger in a room long after they're gone. For days, I felt Patrick everywhere, in the scent of the old books he loved, in the way the morning light hit his favorite armchair. And with that feeling came a quiet resolve. I wasn't going to let Rebecca's version of the story be the final one. I called Daniel Cowan, an old friend and the kind of steady, thoughtful lawyer Patrick had always trusted. We met at a quiet cafe, the kind with chipped mugs and soft jazz playing, and I slid the manila folder across the table. He read everything in silence, his brow tightening when he got to Patrick's shaky handwriting. He didn't offer pity, just a quiet firmness that told me he saw what I saw. "This is more than suspicious, Marietta," he said softly. This is intentional. He pointed out something I hadn't even noticed, the witness signatures on the will Rebecca had presented. They were names neither of us recognized. Patrick always used friends, people we knew and trusted. Bringing in strangers felt wrong, secretive. Daniel said he would start digging quietly. He'd check the official county records, and I would try to piece together Patrick's last few months. Back home, I opened Patrick's old leather-bound calendar. Rebecca had been so thorough in clearing out his things, but she'd missed this. And there, on a Tuesday morning a few months back, was a name circled twice, Hal Givens. I remembered him vaguely, a tax consultant Patrick had met through a charity board. The fact that Patrick had met with him while he was so ill and never mentioned it sent a fresh pang of sorrow through me. I called Daniel, and a few days later, he called me back with what he'd learned. Hal remembered the meeting well. He said Patrick had looked exhausted, his hands trembling so much he could barely hold a pen. He'd asked Hal about the trust, specifically about how to ensure long-term protections for me. Patrick had seemed hesitant, torn. He kept saying that Rebecca was helping, that she would take care of things. Hal, sensing something wasn't right, offered to set up an independent review of the documents. But Patrick never followed through. A week later, Rebecca called Hal's office and canceled the appointment, saying Patrick no longer needed the service. The intake notes from that meeting still existed. They weren't a legal document, but they were proof of Patrick's intent, his worry. That night I pulled out our old photo albums. In picture after picture, there she was, Rebecca, always in the background, smiling, helpful, positioning herself, weaving herself into the fabric of our lives so seamlessly we never saw the pattern she was creating. The betrayal wasn't just in the legal papers. It was in the years of quiet calculation, the slow and steady erosion of Patrick's trust when he was at his most vulnerable. And I finally understood. He hadn't tried to hide things from me to be secretive. He was trying to protect me from a fight he wasn't sure he could win. Sometimes, when you're walking through a storm, you don't realize how deep the water is until it's up to your knees. Daniel called again a few days later, his voice more urgent. He'd found something at the county records office. The final will, the one Rebecca had filed, had a different case number than the original draft we had signed together a year earlier. And that original version? It had vanished from the archives, marked as superseded, with no record of who had authorized the change. It was then that Daniel said we needed more help. He brought in a woman named Lydia Velasquez, a probate litigator. She was sharp, direct, with eyes that missed nothing. She listened to our story, her face unreadable, then asked about the witnesses. When Daniel told her their names, she raised an eyebrow. "I've heard those names before," she said. "They're connected to a case involving unlicensed notaries." It wasn't just sloppy paperwork. It was a carefully constructed deception. That night, driven by an instinct I couldn't explain, I went into the garage and opened Patrick's old metal file cabinet. In a folder from the previous year, tucked away with tax records, I found an unsigned document, Revocable Living Trust Addendum. His handwriting was all over it, changing words, adding clauses under a section titled Survivor Protections. He had been trying to add more layers of security for me. Healthcare, housing, things he wanted to make sure I would never have to worry about. And there, in the margin, a scribbled note that made my heart ache. "We talked about this. Rebecca said she'd handle it." It was the exact moment he'd handed over the reins, exhausted and trusting, and she had taken them and steered everything in a different direction. Lydia said the document was a powerful piece of evidence. It showed his state of mind, his true wishes. With that, she filed a motion to freeze the estate, to stop Rebecca from moving any more assets until our questions were answered. And the court granted it. It was a small victory, but it felt like the first ray of sunshine after a long, dark night. Then an invitation arrived. No return address, just a glossy card for a tribute to Patrick at the country club, hosted by Rebecca. It was a charity auction of his favorite things. I knew I had to go. Not for a fight, but to stand in that room and remind everyone and myself that I was still there. Have you ever had to wear a smile that felt like a mask just to hold yourself together? That's what I did the night of the tribute. I chose a silk blouse Patrick had given me and walked into that country club with my head held high. The room was filled with familiar faces, people who had been to our home for dinner, people who had called Patrick a friend. In the center of it all was Rebecca, playing the part of the grieving, devoted daughter-in-law perfectly. She flickered for just a second when she saw me, a tiny crack in her composure, before her polite smile snapped back into place. On a table were the items for auction: a signed baseball, a vintage pen, and a first-edition novel I had given him for his 60th birthday. The little card beside it said, "From his personal collection." My name was nowhere to be found. It was a small thing, another quiet erasure. I was speaking with one of Patrick's old business partners when he asked me how I was managing the estate. He assumed I was still in charge. When I told him, as calmly as I could, that I had been removed, the look on his face, first confusion, then a dawning discomfort, told me everything. Rebecca hadn't been honest with anyone. She had curated her story, telling people only what she wanted them to hear. I stayed just long enough to learn one more thing. Another old colleague mentioned receiving an email from Rebecca weeks before Patrick passed, outlining her new managing partner responsibilities. She hadn't waited. She had started her takeover while my husband was still fighting for his life. In the car on the way home, it all clicked into place. She had used his illness as cover, his trust as currency, and my grief-stricken silence as permission. But that silence was about to end. The next morning, I gave Lydia everything I had learned. She leaned back in her chair, a thoughtful look on her face. "This is more than a financial dispute now," she said. "This points to premeditation, and that changes everything." The moment Lydia filed the official motion to challenge the will, it felt like the world shifted on its axis. We were no longer just asking questions. We were demanding answers. We alleged undue influence and potential fraud, and the court agreed to a preliminary hearing. That meant we could finally get a look behind the curtain. Lydia subpoenaed Rebecca's internal communications, and a particular email surfaced, sent 6 weeks before Patrick died. The subject line was "Revised Structure, Immediate Actions." In it, Rebecca instructed her team to expedite the trust documents and remove what she called discretionary clauses. My name was mentioned once. Remove co-beneficiary privileges per our discussion. My whole life with Patrick, our shared history, our partnership, reduced to a single cold command in an email. But the biggest crack in Rebecca's story came from an unexpected place. Lydia deposed one of Rebecca's legal assistants, a young woman named Ava Kendall, who had notarized some of the documents. I remember her walking into Lydia's office, looking so nervous but so determined. She told us about a Sunday evening when she'd been asked to witness a signature. She hadn't seen Patrick sign it. Rebecca had just told her it was urgent, that he'd just stepped out. Ava had felt uneasy enough to jot it down in her personal planner. She showed us the page. 7:43 p.m. Sunday. Witnessed signature for R. No P present. Patrick never, ever did business on a weekend. And he never signed anything without reading it to me first. That single note, from a woman I'd never met, was the key. It proved he wasn't there. It proved the documents were fraudulent. That night, for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. I drove to the cemetery and stood by his headstone. I didn't talk to him, not out loud. I just stood there, letting him know that I understood. He had trusted the wrong person, and he had left a mess behind. But I wasn't angry with him anymore. I was going to protect our truth myself. A few days later, a message came from Lydia. Ava, the assistant, had kept her own copies of the documents. And she remembered something else. She had overheard Rebecca on the phone 2 days before Patrick's final hospitalization, telling someone to liquidate silently, no delays. Rebecca hadn't just rewritten the will. She had been planning to drain the accounts before anyone even had a chance to question it. The final piece of the puzzle wasn't a document or a witness, though. It was a performance. Rebecca, believing she was untouchable, called an official board meeting for the foundation Patrick and I had built together. The agenda was to finalize the transfer of her executive authority. It was an invitation to my own execution, a demand that I sit and watch her take the last thing that truly represented our life's work. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my soul, that I had to be there. It's one thing to be told you've been erased, but it's another thing entirely to be asked to attend the ceremony celebrating it. The foundation office was a sleek glass box, cold and impersonal. When I walked into the conference room, the polite smiles I received felt like tiny paper cuts. They were all there, men and women who had shared our table, who had called me a friend. And at the head of the long table sat Rebecca, the picture of quiet, confident power. The meeting started with routine business, but I could feel the tension in the room. Then, they reached the final item on the agenda, the transition of executive oversight. Rebecca began a well-rehearsed speech about continuity and honoring Patrick's vision. Then she did something audacious. She looked directly at me and thanked me for helping to lay the foundation in the early years. "And now," she said, her voice smooth as silk, "with your grace, I carry it forward." With my grace. As if I had willingly handed her the keys to our kingdom. As if I had bowed out. I didn't say a word. I just sat there, my heart beating a steady, calm rhythm. Then I reached into my bag and took out a simple white envelope. I didn't stand. I didn't raise my voice. I just quietly passed it to the man sitting beside me, one of Patrick's oldest friends. He looked confused, but he took it. Inside was a copy of Ava's signed statement, a summary from Lydia's legal brief, and the page from our original trust agreement showing where Rebecca had crossed out my name. He read it, his face paling slightly, and passed it on. The envelope made its way around the table, a silent messenger of truth. I could see Rebecca's smile tighten, her composure starting to fray at the edges as the quiet rustle of paper filled the room. When the last person had read it, I slowly stood up. "Thank you for the invitation," I said, my voice even and clear. "My attorney will be in touch if anyone here requires clarification." And then I turned and walked out. I didn't run. I didn't need to. In that silent room, the truth had finally spoken louder than any lie she could ever tell. The days that followed were the quietest I had known in a long time. It was the kind of stillness that comes after a storm has passed, when the air is clean and you can finally see the sky again. The Foundation's board immediately postponed their vote. An internal review was launched. Then on a Sunday afternoon, Lydia called. Rebecca's lawyers had reached out. She was withdrawing from her position at the Foundation and would no longer challenge our inquiry into the trust. There was no apology, no admission of guilt, just a cold statement about protecting the Foundation's reputation. I didn't feel a surge of triumph. I just felt relief, like a heavy coat I didn't know I was wearing had finally been lifted from my shoulders. A few days later, in a drawer I hadn't opened in years, I found another envelope. It was a will Patrick had written a year before he got sick, one I didn't even know existed. It was filled with his notes, his hopes, and his unwavering instructions about my role as his lifelong partner in everything we built. He'd ended it with a line that brought tears to my eyes. "Family isn't about last names," he wrote. "It's about standing beside each other in silence when no one is watching." He had known even then what truly mattered. And he had tried, in his own way, to make sure it was protected. Spring arrived slowly that year, bringing with it a sense of gentle renewal. The foundation, now led by a committee of Patrick's trusted old colleagues, invited me to their annual donor luncheon. I wasn't sure I wanted to go, but something told me I should. I wore a simple gray suit and pinned one of Patrick's old lapel pins, a small silver oak tree, to my collar. The event was just as it had always been, but something felt different. Rebecca was gone, her name quietly removed from the programs. Near the end of the lunch, a new board member, a young woman with a kind face, stood up to speak. She talked about the foundation's mission, about the people who had built it from the ground up. And then she looked right at me. She said my name, and she spoke about the quiet strength of those who hold a legacy through the storm. The room turned toward me, and a wave of warm, gentle applause filled the air. I stood just for a moment and nodded. It wasn't about vindication. It was about acknowledgement. It was about coming home. That evening, I sat in my kitchen, the same room where I had once felt so lost and invisible, and brewed a cup of tea. I stepped out onto the back porch and looked up at the vast, open sky. I had not sought revenge. I had not burned anything down. I had simply refused to disappear. I had reclaimed my place, not with anger, but with truth. I was not a woman erased. I was whole. And I was finally peacefully at home in my own story. If you've ever had to fight, not with a loud voice, but with a quiet and steady heart, to reclaim your own story, I hope you know you are not alone. Sometimes the most powerful victories are the ones that happen in the silence, when we simply refuse to let our truth be rewritten.